Well, greetings of peace. How good it is to be here to tell you how honoured I feel to deliver this inaugural series of lectures. As many of you know, Dr. Nasser was supposed to deliver the first lectures last year, but unfortunately ill health prevented him from being able to do so. But I take this opportunity to echo Michael's words and to pay my deepest respects to Dr. Nasser, who has been the preeminent spokesman for perennialism since the death of Frithjof Schuon. I also want to respect Graduate School. What a pleasure it is to find such an institution amidst the wasteland of academia in the modern world. I've spent all of my adult life in universities. I regret to say at this point in my life, most of them don't deserve the name of universities. They have certainly betrayed the traditional ideal of a university in which theology was the queen of the disciplines. Well, in many universities today, there are no theological studies at all. Now, it's a strange thing, ladies and gentlemen, because I've been asked to travel all the way across the world from the other side, all those many miles, to come and talk to people who know more about this subject than I do. So this is very puzzling. But I shall do my best. I feel a bit like Samuel being called in the night. In other words, an entreaty which one could not turn one's back on. So however inadequate my qualifications might be, I was called, I could not say no, and here I am. Now, we've had the purposes of the Schuon Lectures given to us already in outline, so I won't dwell on that for the moment, but I do want to refer to the words of Ananda Coomaraswamy, another one of the great traditionalists, who said this about his own work: "I am not a reformer or a propagandist. I am not putting forward any new or private doctrines or interpretations. For me, there are certain axioms, principles, or values beyond question. My interest is not in thinking up new ones, but in the application of those that are." That is very much my purpose today as well. I also recall Frithjof Schuon's remark, "Everything has already been said, and well said, but one must always recall it anew." So looking around the audience here, I see some familiar faces. And some of you have heard me talk before. You will forgive me if I go over some of the same ground, but certain things are worth saying over and over again. I'm also mindful of Albert Camus' remark, "Some people talk in their sleep. Lecturers talk while other people sleep." If you're inclined to sleep during these lectures, that's okay. Feel free, especially those of you who have heard me before. All right, so to get to the subject at hand, today what I want to do is talk about these three periods of human history, these three epochs: the primordial, the traditional, the modern. And to try and get some sort of understanding of the way they understood the world, the way they understood time and space, the way they understood the human place in the natural order, the way they understood the human vocation. Now, you know the old American custom of having biblical verses embroidered on something and you hang them on the living room wall so that we can constantly remind ourselves of these eternal verities? Well, there are two of these that I want you to hang on your inner mind, so to speak, and just keep them there for reference as we go along. I'm not going to expatiate on them now. I'm just hanging them on the wall, so to speak. Two of them. The first one comes from Shankara, the great Vedantan sage, 18th century India. And of course, Schuon regarded Shankara as perhaps the most eminent of all metaphysicians. He certainly regarded the Vedanta as the most adequate metaphysical system. I use the word adequate because it's not exhaustive. No metaphysical system can ever be exhaustive. By being what it is, it can't be something else, just as a triangle can't be a square. By being a triangle, the possibility of being a square is excluded. However, Schuon did regard Shankara as a great authority in the metaphysical field. So the quote from Shankara, "The world of Maya," that is, the world of time and space, this world we're living in, this world of multiplicity and relativity and change, impermanence. The world of Maya, including the visible heavens, the whole thing, the whole show, the world of Maya is not inexplicable. It is only not self-explanatory. What does he mean by this? Well, quite simply, he means that the world of time and space cannot be understood without reference to what is beyond time and space. Now, of course, the modern project is precisely to understand Maya in its own terms. This is a futile project from the beginning. It is like trying to capture the wind in a net. Or to quote the Zen master, it is like looking for the footprints of the birds in the sky. They are not to be found. The second quote I want you to keep in mind, it comes from Schuon himself. It's a very simple quote. "Man's vocation is consciousness of the absolute." Man's vocation is consciousness of the absolute. Okay, now, if we were to stand back and take a sort of very broad view, which is what I have to do in these lectures, and of course this means I'm painting on rather a large canvas, and it's inevitable that a certain amount of paint is going to be spilt, and there will be reckless generalisations thrown about. But let's try and take the sort of long view. Now, if we ask ourselves, well, what is the modern understanding of these three epochs? It's very simple. Many years ago, I think it was in the early 70s, there was a television series. Some of you, a few of you at least, are old enough perhaps to remember it. It was called The Ascent of Man, hosted by a very eminent scientist called Jacob Bronowski. The story he presented in that is just typical. It's the conventional account. So what do? We look back through eons of time. What do we start with? Matter. Slowly, over a long period of time, by some process that no one can explain, life appears. Primeval slime, algae, single-celled organisms. We go on through millions of years. The creatures emerge. Eventually, a sort of primate, a sort of semi-human appears. You know, you've seen pictures, you've seen drawings of these in the textbooks, you know, sort of hunched over creature, sort of, overhanging brow, sort of shuffling along, sort of knuckles dragging along the ground, sort of grunting. Out of all this emerges somehow language. This is the story. And things go on slowly over a long period of time, hunting and gathering and so on, and then sedentary civilizations appear. It's an ascent. It's a climb out of the primeval slime, ever upwards. We get to the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and so on and so forth. It's a wonderful liberation. What came before is an age of superstition, of oppression, of savagery. We emerge into a much sunnier climate. Things are going to be ever so much better. The progress, the idea of progress. Well, you know it perfectly well, ladies and gentlemen. They've got it all upside down and back to front. Man doesn't ascend out of the cosmic dust. Man descends from above. Man descends from heaven. So my contention is that The very way in which we have been taught to think about time and to look back over the past is a very precarious foundation for anything. It's the wrong way to start. So let's have a quick look at traditional and modern ideas about time and space. So if we're looking back to primordial cultures, which is to say indigenous cultures, nomadic cultures, non-literate cultures, their worldview is based on myths. Now again, if we ask the modern folk about myths, what are they? Well, they're kind of fabrications, kind of imaginative stories that people made up when they didn't really understand what was going on. They didn't have the benefit of modern science. They were puzzled by natural phenomena. They were trying to make sense of things, so they made up these stories. They're fabulous stories, colourful stories, but stories, fabrications. Well, of course, from our point of view, from a perennialist point of view, that's not what myths are at all. Yes, they're stories, but they're stories that embody truths that can't be expressed in any other way, as Coomaraswamy said. And myths actually always have 3 or 4 dimensions, including the metaphysical. That is to say, including some account or some intimation of what lies beyond time and space, what lies beyond the material world. They're also cosmological, which is to say we find some account of the world at large, of time and space. They are also anthropological in the sense that they tell us about man's place in the world, the human place in the world. In the mythological view of things, there is always a sort of differentiation of sacred and profane. And so it is with time and space. Time itself and space can be sacred or profane. So this is a very important kind of qualitative distinction which disappears more or less with modernity, as Guénon made so clear in his book, The Reign of Quantity. So for these people, as Schuon puts it, and Guénon also, these people live primarily in space, not in time. Their understanding, their way of orienting themselves in the world is primarily spatial. As Dr. Nasser says in one of his books, there are those traditions which live in space and for whom time and history are of little consequence, and those which live in time and which take history into account as being of religious and ultimate significance. It was only during the later phases of the cycle that gradually the experience of time in its non-cyclic aspect became consequential and history began to gain significance. All right, so if we look ahead to what I'm calling the traditional worlds as distinct from the primordial, one of the characteristics of this mode is the growth of a sort of historical consciousness, but within a religious framework, so that the understanding of time is derived from the revelation in question and is in accord with that, the teachings of that revelation. Now here, of course, we get ideas about teleology, about a divine purpose being worked out through time. The mythological view of time, I neglected to say, but you all know perfectly well anyway, is largely cyclical, or perhaps better than cyclical, spiralistic. I don't know if there is such a word, spiralistic or spiral-like. So it's not endlessly repeating itself like this, it's more like this. So there's kind of movement in 2 directions going on simultaneously, so to speak. Now, we get to the modern age. What is our view of time? Well, you know what it is, ladies and gentlemen. Time's a line, it starts over there, it goes over there, and we can measure it in years or minutes or hours, whatever, with clocks. And time is all the same. What are you talking about, sacred and profane? What is all this nonsense about sacred time and profane time? There's just time. It's just time. Same with space. What is space? Well, basically it's empty. How do we think about the universe? This huge empty space with bits and pieces flying about in this empty space. And how do we account for all of this? Well, electromagnetism, gravity, etc., etc. So we've got two very different understandings. The modern view is based on two things, the modern view of time and space. One, it's based on a materialistic science. That is to say, an empirical science which aims to understand the modern world by an investigation into material phenomena. If Shankar is right, that's a futile exercise. It's also based on historicism. That is to say, this preoccupation, this obsession with history, which is a very modern phenomenon, particularly if we think of it as profane history, as modern folk do. So historicism is the idea that if you want to explain something, if you want to understand something, what you need to do is trace its history. You know, where did this start? Who was the first person who said this? Where did this idea come from? Where did this institution come from? And we trace its history through time. What happened here, 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 here. And eventually we get to the present. When we've traced the history of the thing, we've understood it. That's a historicist kind of understanding, which is not shared in the traditional and primordial worlds. Mircea Eliade, the great Romanian comparative religionist, had this to say: "This interest in history is manifested in two distinct ways, which are, however, related. First, in what may be called a passion for historiography, the desire for an ever more complete and exact knowledge of the past of humanity, above all the past of our Western world. Secondly, the interest in history is manifested in contemporary Western philosophy, in the tendency to define man as above all a historical being, conditioned and in the end created by history." So in a certain sense, history has replaced God, and this is one of the characteristics of the modern age. Now, Eliade makes a very interesting suggestion about this. He says that the obsession with history and the attempt to construct a kind of exhaustive history of humankind is like life flashing before the eyes of a dying man. So he thinks this obsession in history is a kind of death spasm. It's a kind of symptom of a civilization dying. And I'm certainly not prepared to say he's wrong. Schuon himself remarks, "History, after all, is but the rhythm of universal decadence." Which brings me to the next important point, which is about cosmic cycles. Now, again, if you want to go into a modern academic institution and start talking about cosmic cycles, you're going to be given some very peculiar looks. You must be some sort of weirdo talking about cosmic cycles. But of course, this is a kind of foundational idea in perennialist thought in particular, and it's expounded in some detail by René Guénon. Schuon himself, I think very understandably, didn't have a lot to say on this subject. It's a volatile subject and it's a dangerous subject, and it's not something we need unduly concern ourselves with. However, it is important to understand in just sort of very broad general outline what it's all about. I'm sure most of you know already, but let me just remind you. So it's in the Hindu tradition that we find the doctrine of cycles given its most complete elaboration, but we can find it in various other places. Schuon says it's present in one form or another in just about every tradition, every culture. So under Guénon's exposition in the reign of quantity, which is the locus classicus for this sort of thing, there are four ages associated with the four metals, gold, silver, bronze, iron. And through time, we go through these cycles, and it is a story of decline, of descent, of degeneration, and that we are now in the Kali Yuga, the end of a great cosmic cycle when things have gone downhill almost as far as they can go. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to know what the Kali Yuga looks like, all you have to do is look outside. Watch television for half an hour, read a newspaper. You know what the Kali Yuga is all about. It's about spiritual sterility. It's about illusion. It's about hubris. Here's how the Vishnu Purana put it. This is a scripture, Hindu scripture, written 1,500 years ago. But if this doesn't sound familiar to you, I'll be surprised. Riches and piety will diminish daily. This is a description of the Kali Yuga. Until the world will be completely corrupted. In those days, it will be wealth that confers distinction. Passion will be the sole reason for union between the sexes. Lies will be the only method of success in business. And women will be the objects of sensual gratification. The earth will be valued only for its mineral treasures. Dishonesty will be universal. A simple ablution will be regarded as a sufficient purification. The observances of castes, laws and institutions will no longer be in force. And the ceremonies prescribed by the Vedas will be neglected. Women will obey only their whims and will be infatuated with pleasure. Men of all kinds will be presumptuously regard themselves as the equals of Brahmins. The Vaishyas will abandon agriculture and commerce and will earn their living by servitude or by the exercise of mechanical professions. The dominant caste will be that of the Shudras. So said the Vishnu Purana. Here's St. Paul, writing even earlier. In the last days, perilous times shall come. Men will love nothing but money and self. They will be arrogant, boastful, and abusive, with no respect for parents, no gratitude, no piety, no natural affection. They will be men who will put pleasure in the place of God, who preserve the outward form of religion but are a standing denial of its reality, ever learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Okay, so we've got the idea that things go downhill. Over a long period of time, things go downhill. Now, eventually the cycle works itself out, it exhausts itself, all possibilities have happened. That will be the end of the cycle. And now Gainon and Schuon both thought we were pretty close to the end of the cycle. But there is no point in getting preoccupied with this. You know, there's people who want to work out the dates and they look up all these ancient scriptures and they add up numbers and they try and tell us when the Armageddon is going to come. When's it all going to finish? This is a complete waste of time, ladies and gentlemen. It has nothing to do with our most imperative needs, with the one thing needful, which is saving our own souls. As Dr. Nasser remarked at another conference, which I was fortunate enough to attend, he said there are far too many experts on the Kali Yuga. So I don't want to set myself up as an expert on the Kali Yuga, but this understanding of time is important. All right, now to get to primordial societies, a huge subject, and I only have time to just intimate a few themes and motifs without having time to go into them in any great depth. Incidentally, eventually you will get a chance to ask questions, and I don't know how much time we're going to have today because we've used up time with introductions and so on, but I hope we have some time. But this is a very important part of proceedings, at least as important as the lectures themselves, is to have some interchange. And it's a chance for you to tell me where I've got everything wrong and set me right, put me on the right path. So if you disagree with anything I've said and you would like to ventilate your view, that will be very welcome. And the little bit of creative friction might even be good. So don't be afraid of disagreement. We don't want to have blood on the floor. We don't want to go quite that far, but we do want to have sort of robust discussion when the time arrives. Okay, now, so if we're to ask ourselves, what was the primordial world like? What was it like for human beings back then, and what characteristics can we observe in these societies insofar as we can understand them? And of course, we can understand them through the remnants, so to speak, which is the survival into the modern world of primordial cultures and traditions. The key point here is that they're non-literate, for reasons I'll explain in a few moments. They're non-literate. Don't use the term pre-literate. They're not pre-literate, they're non-literate. They're usually nomadic. They're the cultures we refer to loosely as First Peoples or Indigenous peoples. And of course we have in your country and in mine, the Indigenous people, the Native Americans here and the Aborigines in Australia. Now there are three serious obstacles to understand anything about the primordial world, and you've got to somehow find your way over these obstacles or around them to come to grips with the primordial world. The first is actually a very difficult barrier, and it's insuperable, and it's what Guénon calls barriers in time. He says in The Reign of Quantity that if we go back more than about 3,000 years, we are speculating. It is very hard to say anything with any degree of confidence about anything that happened more than roughly 3,000 years ago. There is a huge amount of guesswork that goes on about what happened thousands of years ago, which is presented as fact, usually framed in a kind of evolutionist theory, which if you're waiting for me to get fired up, wait till we get to evolutionism, but that won't be till lecture 3. So it's difficult to know anything with any degree of certainty about what was going on tens of thousands of years ago. But let me put this idea in front of you. It comes from Schuon. And this is a statement which I think the average person in the modern world would find quite shocking and quite challenging. A lot of people would find it completely absurd. For myself, I think it's altogether true and profound. Original man was not a simian being, that is to say, not an ape-like creature, barely capable of speaking and standing upright. He was a quasi-immaterial being enclosed in an aura still celestial, but deposited on earth. An aura similar to the chariot of fire of Elijah or the cloud that enveloped Christ's ascension. Well, how different this creature is from the shuffling, grunting, club-wielding primate chewing on a raw bone. A creature not completely materialised. Those of you who know Guénon's work, particularly The Reign of Quantity, will remember that he makes a great deal of two processes in the modern world. One he calls solidification or materialisation. So according to this view, the world has become more and more materialised, more and more heavy, more and more anchored in matter. At the same time, there is the process of dissolution. So all of the institutions, the ideas, the values that have survived for hundreds, thousands of years in some cases, are now falling to pieces. You can actually see these two processes, solidification and dissolution, at work in the religious domain today. So fundamentalism, militant kind of fundamentalism, I'm using the word in a pejorative sense. I know it's got several different ways of you can understand it and nuance it, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Fundamentalism is an instance of solidification, petrifaction, fossilisation, if you like. and liberalism, laissez-faire, anything goes, is dissolution. Anyway, that's another story which we won't pursue today. So the barriers in time, mistaken ideas about human origins are two of the big problems. The third problem is evolutionary theory. And of course, evolutionary theory is a materialistic theory. I'm going to talk about this at some length later in the week, but for the moment, let me just quote Schuon. It's Burkhardt I'm quoting this time. It is certain that the process of materialisation, going from supersensory to sensory, had to be reflected within the material or corporeal state itself. So, one is on safe ground in saying that the first generations of a new species, earliest human beings, did not leave their mark in the great book of earthly layering, the paleontological record and all that. It is therefore useless to want to seek in sensible matter the ancestors of a species, and especially those of man. So, if we can work our way around those three problems, we can make a start. Now, one of the most melancholy spectacles of the modern world is the destruction of nomadic cultures. Modernity, just like a juggernaut, just rolled over these cultures wherever they were to be found, exterminating them, destroying them, erasing them from the face of the earth. You know how many people are so upset about the loss of biological species? In my country, there's a lot of fuss about, the yellow-bellied parrot, for example. Well, I'm very sorry if the yellow-bellied parrot is in danger of extinction. That is a very, very bad thing. But how much more serious when these human groups, these human cultures, these human languages are being eradicated just as quickly, and they're pretty well all gone. Let me read you the words of Marco Pallis talking about Tibet. This is just a kind of, a case study, an example of what we're dealing with here. One can truly say that this remote land behind the snowy rampart of the Himalaya had become like the chosen sanctuary for all those things whereof the historical discarding had caused our present profane civilization, the first of its kind to come into being. The violation of this sanctuary and the dissipation of the sacred influences concentrated there became an event of properly cosmic significance, of which the ulterior consequences for a world which tacitly condoled the outrage, or in many cases openly countenanced it on the plea that it brought progress to a reluctant people, have yet to ripen. That can be said about the destruction of any indigenous culture. Talk about the Bedouin of the Middle East, or the Indians in the Amazonian jungle, or the Australian Aborigines, or the Inuit, or the Kalahari Bushmen. All over the world, same story. Going on, in discussing all of this, refers to the biblical story of Cain and Abel. So you'll remember that Cain murders his brother Abel. The significant point being that that Abel is a herdsman, a nomad, in other words. So Cain represents the sedentary civilization and Abel the nomadic. And so the story takes on a whole new resonance. Abel is slain again and again, and more than ever in the 20th century. Okay, so what are some aspects of primordial civilizations, if you want to use that word, cultures, traditions? There are just a few that I want to comment on briefly. Mythology, I've already said something about. I might say a little more about that. What Schuon calls the symbolist mentality, the sense of the sacred, which provides these cultures, and their understanding of the cosmos at large and of the natural order, and the richness of an orally based culture. as opposed to a literate culture. So time is marching on, and I must accelerate the pace. So what is a symbol? Well, according to the modern view, the symbol is just something that stands for something else. Like in Australia, for example, we have the symbol of the kangaroo. It's all over the place. What's the kangaroo? The kangaroo is Australia. Well, why is the kangaroo Australia? Well, everybody sees kangaroos, everyone knows kangaroos, so let's agree on the kangaroo. But they could just as easily chosen the platypus or the wombat or the emu or the kookaburra, all sorts of animals. It's just a sign that we've agreed means such and such. You know, like your American flag. You see an American flag, you know, this represents America, you know, the original colonies and so on. They're not symbols, they're signs. A symbol is something which participates analogically on one level, reflecting a reality of a higher order. That's what a symbol is. Not just an arbitrary sign that has been kind of culturally constructed over a period of time. Symbolism, according to the traditional view, symbolism is inherent in everything. It's inherent in the natural order. It's inherent in the human form. Why does the human being stand erect? This is of profound significance. Why do birds sing at dawn? Why do plants grow towards the sun? Well, let us ask a scientist, why do plants grow towards the sun? What are we going to get? Again, a whole lot of talk about chlorophyll, manufacture of carbohydrates, capillary tubes, That's not why plants grow towards the sun, ladies and gentlemen, you know that. Plants grow to the sun because everything returns to its source. Everything is striving to return from whence it came, striving to return to God. And of course, the sun is the perfect symbol for God. So the traditional mind, especially the primordial mind, doesn't think in symbols in terms of, let's agree that, you know, the buffalo represents such and such. These things are self-evident. They're intuited. They don't have to be kind of spelt out. They're just there. So primordial peoples think in symbols. They don't think in abstract concepts. They think in symbols, lived realities. And you can get the most extraordinarily complicated metaphysical systems, that's not quite the right word, but metaphysical understandings expressed visually and ritually and in other ways as distinct from texts, written books. So, for example, if you think those of you who know something about the Native Americans will know something about the Sundance, it's a metaphysical textbook. It's not there in words, not there in abstract argumentation, but anyone who can understand the symbolism of what's going on, it's all perfectly clear. So this kind of way of seeing the world is radically different from ours. Let me just read you one or two quick quotes from Schuon on this subject. The symbolist consciousness sees appearances in connection with their essences. It sees things not superficially only, but also in depth. It perceives them in their participative as well as their separative dimension. This is a very profound concept and perhaps not easily understood, but it's a very important one. Everything in nature, everything in world, everything in human life participates in a greater order, and it derives its significance and its beauty and its dignity from that participation. And we're all involved in this. Another passage from Schuon. The Indian, he's talking about the American Indians, the Indian is predisposed towards the suprasensible and strives to penetrate the hard wall of the sensible world, seeks openings where he can, and finds them chiefly in phenomenon themselves, which indeed in their contents are nothing other than signposts to the suprasensible. Things are hard, this is lovely, things are hard, frozen melodies from the beyond, melodies from the beyond. The Indian world signifies first and foremost, and we could say this about all of these primordial peoples, the Indian world signifies first and foremost the reading of the primordial doctrine in the phenomena of nature. In other words, nature is, if you like, a text. Nature is a teaching. And nature is a theophany. That the natural order reveals God. This is its highest and most profound function. Likewise, Dr. Nasser says, on the highest level, I've read this quote out at a few conferences and whatnot where the audience was much less sympathetic and receptive than you folk are, and this quote caused a lot of consternation and a lot of puzzlement and a bit of anger. On the highest level, virgin nature can be contemplated as a theophany, that is to say, a revelation of God, which possesses its own metaphysical message and spiritual discipline. Nature reveals the one and its multiple qualities. It prays and invokes. Nature, the natural world, prays and invokes. I've got to supply an endless supply of quotes from these people, but I must give you one more from Schuon, one of my favourites. Virgin nature is at one with holy poverty and also with spiritual childlikeness. She, virgin nature, she is an open book containing an inexhaustible treasury of truth and beauty. It is in the midst of his own artifices that man most easily becomes corrupted. It is they that make him covetous and impious. Close to virgin nature, who knows neither agitation nor falsehood, he has the hope of remaining contemplative like nature itself. Okay, so he's referring there, of course, to the sense of the sacred which pervades primordial cultures and societies. A sense of the transparency of the material world, the behind the world of appearances, behind the world of relativities, behind the world of constant change, the world of impermanence. Behind all of that, there is an unchanging, immutable, beautiful, profound, noble, we could go on and on, reality that manifests itself through the natural world. So how different this is from the way most of us these days think about nature insofar as we think about it at all. On one end of the spectrum, we've got nature is a quarry. Nature is raw materials. Right? Nature's there to be exploited. Let's dig up the minerals. Let's harness this. Let's have hydroelectric schemes here. No. It's just all raw material to be turned to commercial ends, to money making. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got this sort of much more attractive but still mistaken, environmentalism of a sort of sentimental kind, a sort of ersatz pantheism, a sort of nature worship. But of course, it's not really worship. To have proper worship, you need the transcendent as well as the immanent. And what a lot of modern environmentalists are caught up in is a view of things where they think they can have the immanence, the divine presence in the natural world, without the transcendence. So it's like asking for a one-sided coin, how do you manage it? You can't. Okay, so this sense of sacred is pervasive in the primordial worlds, and it persists into the traditional worlds. Now, just a few more minutes, ladies and gentlemen. You've been very patient, but I must talk about literacy briefly. Kumaraswamy, wonderful metaphor. Some of you have heard it before from me, and others of you will have read it in his marvellous book, The Bugbear of Literacy. Hey, what is literacy? Well, Kumaraswamy says literacy is rather like a wooden leg. Now, if you're a person who's had some terrible mishap, fallen out of a tree or been run over by a tractor or something, and your leg has been shattered and amputated, well then of course a wooden leg is very useful, very handy thing to have, and you're very glad to have a wooden leg because you can still get about. But of what interest is a wooden leg to a two-legged person? There's no interest at all, really. Literacy is like the wooden leg. It only becomes necessary, it only becomes part of the scheme of things, it only emerges, so to speak, at a point where a certain deprivation has taken place, a certain degradation in consciousness has taken place. So far from being the huge leap forward and the giant step upwards that it's usually portrayed as, it's actually a symptom of a decline. Now, even Plato, who's often accredited with the move in ancient Greece from the mythological vision to the rational vision, much closer to our own sort of scientific way of understanding things, Plato's accredited with this apparent advance, which is not really an advance. But even Plato has something interesting to say about literacy. I read this at the Notre Dame conference a couple of years ago, so those of you who were there will just have to hear it again, but it won't do you any harm. This invention of letters, of writing, will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it because they will not exercise their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have invented an elixir not of memory but of reminding, and you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom. For they will read many things without teaching and will therefore seem to know many things when they are for the most part ignorant and hard to get along with, since they are not wise but only wiseacres. That's Plato. Kumaraswamy on the same theme. From the Hindu point of view, a man can only be said to know what he knows by heart. What he must go to a book to be reminded of, he merely knows of. From the earliest times, Indians have thought of, where's the rest of the quote? A learned man not as one who has read much, but as one who has been profoundly taught. It is much rather from a master than from any book that a wisdom can be learned. And of course, this is precisely the way it works in primordial cultures. You don't learn things by reading books. You learn them from a master. You learn them from the elders. You learn them from the people who know directly. Okay, I think my time is just about up. So I must bring things to an end. Perhaps I'll just finish with a very brief anecdote. So I'm sitting in my office at the university, minding my own business, and I get an email from the chief librarian. Very, very excited email. Very, very happy she is. She sent all staff an email saying, you can now log into the database of the Bureau of Census and Statistics. Any stuff they've got there, you can hook straight into it. So I sent her an email in reply. I said, this is a lamentable development. I'm very sorry to hear about it, and I wish it hadn't happened. Well, she got on the phone. She was very puzzled. She was very puzzled. What was with me? What was I talking about? How could I possibly not be happy about this new development? And I said to her, well, the fact of the matter is that the university has become a kind of machine for generating and accumulating useless information. You want information about almost anything, well, we've got it for you. It's all there in the Bureau of Census and Statistics, and you just have to push the button and it will spew out of your computer. I said, well, I'm not really interested in that kind of information. I'm inclined rather to agree with St. Thomas Aquinas. The slenderest knowledge of higher things is more desirable than the most prodigious knowledge of lower things. So that's where we need to keep our eyes focused on the higher things. And as Guy Eaton said in his excellent book, King of the Castle, we, meaning we modern folk, we know more and more about less and less. We know more and more about less and less. All right, so next time it will be tradition as we understand it through history, the historical traditions, the great revelations. What are the characteristics of these sorts of societies and cultures? And of course, a lot of the aspects of primordial cultures carry over into the traditional world, somewhat modified here and there, but it's only with the arrival of modernity that there is a severe rupture and dislocation. And I'm about to finish. If you want to know what, I used to ask my students, we'd be talking in all these times, and say, what do you think the word modern means? What's modern mean? When does the modern era start? Yes, 1789. Oh, okay, French Revolution. Another one, hey, yeah, 1850s. Why is that? Oh, Industrial Revolution. One student told me it started in 1945, the end of the Second World War. Modernity is since the end of the Second World War. Now, I almost certainly don't need to alert you to the fact that when I'm talking about modernity, I'm talking about, at least as far as the Western world is concerned, I'm talking about post-medieval. So we're talking the best part of 1,000 years, the modern era. So that will be the subject for the third lecture. The fourth lecture is a little different. We forget all about time and different periods and epochs and all of that, and we just ask two very simple questions. What is metaphysics? And what does it have to do with the spiritual life? So that's the fourth lecture. So thank you so much for coming.